At 14:07 hours on May 1st, 1943, Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith looked up through the plexiglass of his ball turret and saw his bomber dying. Smoke poured from the waist section of the B-17F directly above him. Through the haze, he could see orange flames licking at the aluminum skin of the fuselage. The intercom had gone dead 90 seconds earlier. The last thing he'd heard was someone screaming about fire. Now there was only the roar of wind through holes that hadn't existed 3 minutes ago. Smith was curled in the Sperry ball turret, suspended beneath the belly of the aircraft at 22,000 feet over Saint-Nazaire, France. The turret was 34 inches in diameter. He was 32 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, and folded into a fetal position with twin Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns between his knees. The temperature outside the plexiglass was 40 degrees below zero. Inside the fuselage above him, the temperature was rising toward 1,000 degrees. This was his first combat mission. The 306th Bombardment Group had launched from Thurley, England, at 8:47 hours that morning. 34 B-17 flying fortresses had crossed the channel in formation, bound for the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast. The target was one of the most heavily defended in occupied Europe. Intelligence briefings had warned of 88mm flak batteries ringing the harbor. They had warned of Focke-Wulf Fw 190 fighters from JG-2 stationed at nearby airfields. They had warned that the 306th had lost more aircraft over Saint-Nazaire than any other target in the 8th Air Force's brief combat history. What the briefings hadn't warned about was what would happen to a troublemaker from Michigan on his first day of war. Smith rotated the ball turret, scanning for fighters. His twin 50s tracked across the sky. Empty shell casings rolled in the curved floor beneath his sheepskin-lined boots. Through the lower hemisphere of plexiglass, he could see the French coastline 22,000 feet below. Green fields, gray towns, the glittering Atlantic stretching toward America. Through the upper hemisphere, he could see the belly of his own aircraft. The belly was on fire. Flames now curled around the ball turret's mounting ring. Smoke streamed past the plexiglass in black ribbons. Smith could feel heat radiating through the aluminum above his head. The manual crank for emergency egress was to his right. He grabbed it and began rotating. The ball turret was designed to retract into the fuselage for landing. In combat, the gunner entered through a hatch in the floor of the bomber, climbed down into the sphere, and sealed himself inside. The only way out was back through that hatch. If the fuselage was on fire, the only way out was through the fire. Smith cranked faster. The B-17F, designated 4124406, nicknamed Werewolf, had been airborne for 5 hours and 20 minutes. The aircraft belonged to the 423rd Bombardment Squadron and carried a crew of 10: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, 2 waist gunners, ball turret gunner, and tail gunner. Smith had met most of them for the first time that morning. The 306th had a policy of mixing replacement crews with experienced men. Smith was a replacement. He had been assigned to Werewolf because their regular ball turret gunner was in the base hospital with pneumonia. The pneumonia had saved that man's life. The flak had started at 13:58 hours as the formation crossed the French coast at 2,250 feet. Black bursts appeared ahead of the bombers, then around them, then among them. The B-17 to Smith's left, he didn't know its name, took a direct hit in the number 2 engine and fell away trailing fire. The B-17 above and behind exploded, simply ceased to exist, leaving nothing but a spreading cloud of aluminum fragments and human remains. Smith had watched 3 parachutes descend from a 3rd bomber before his turret rotated and brought new sky into view. Then the Focke-Wulfs arrived. They came from the northeast, 12 Fw-190A A4s from the Harcourts, JG2, diving through the bomber formation at over 400 miles per hour. Smith saw them for perhaps 3 seconds, angular silhouettes with radial engines and that distinctive wide landing gear. Before they were past, their cannons and machine guns raking the formation. A B-17 ahead of Werewolf staggered, recovered, staggered again, and began descending with 2 engines feathered. Smith had fired 147 rounds at the fighters. He had no idea if he'd hit anything. The Fw-190s pulled up, curved around, and came back for a second pass. This time they came from below and behind, from Smith's domain. He pressed the butterfly triggers and felt the twin 50s hammer against his legs. Tracers arced across the sky. A Focke-Wulf flashed through his sights, and Smith saw pieces fly from its engine, cowling before it rolled away. He was screaming something. He didn't know what. The intercom was dead. The third pass killed Werewolf. The 20mm cannon shells walked down the fuselage from tail to nose. Smith heard them punching through aluminum above his head, a sound like a giant typewriter. Then the ball turret bucked, the plexiglass cracked, and something hit him in the left thigh. He looked down and saw a hole in his flight suit. No blood. The round had gone through the fabric without touching flesh. The Fw-190s were gone. Climbing back up for another pass, the flak was still bursting around the formation, and above Smith's head, the B-17 was filling with smoke. He finished cranking the turret to the entry position and reached for the hatch handle. The metal was hot. Not warm. Hot. Hot enough that even through his flight gloves, he could feel it threatening to sear his palms. Smith shoved the hatch open. The waist section of the B-17 was an inferno. Flames climbed the left side of the fuselage from floor to ceiling. Burning hydraulic fluid ran across the deck like water. The aluminum skin was glowing orange in patches. Smoke was so thick that Smith could barely see the waist gun positions 15 feet away. He could see enough. Both waist gunners were gone. Their guns hung empty in their mounts. The starboard waist door was open, and freezing air was pouring in at 200 miles per hour, feeding the flames like a bellows. The radio compartment forward was a wall of fire. The tail section aft was invisible behind smoke. Smith was alone in the burning rear half of a B-17 flying fortress, 22,000 feet above Nazi-occupied France, with German fighters circling for another attack. He pulled himself out of the ball turret. The heat hit him like a physical force. His flight suit began smoldering immediately. His oxygen mask was still connected to the ball turret supply. He ripped it free and held his breath. There was no oxygen in the waist section. There was only smoke and fire and the howl of wind through 100 holes in the fuselage. A fire extinguisher hung on the forward bulkhead. Smith lunged for it, his boots slipping on burning hydraulic fluid. He grabbed the cylinder, pulled the pin, and aimed at the base of the nearest flames. White foam sprayed across the fire. The flames retreated, then advanced around the edges of the foam. Smith sprayed again. Again. The extinguisher was a single-use CO2 model. It held perhaps 40 seconds of suppressant. He was trying to extinguish a fire that had already consumed half the aircraft. He sprayed until the extinguisher was empty. The fire was still burning. Smith threw the empty cylinder aside and looked around for another. There wasn't one. The other extinguisher, the backup, was supposed to be mounted on the aft bulkhead, near the tail. He couldn't see the aft bulkhead. He couldn't see anything aft of the waist gun positions. Just smoke, thick as a wool blanket, impenetrable. Then he heard the scream. It came from the tail section. It was weak, barely audible over the wind and the crackling flames. But it was unmistakably human. Someone was still alive back there. Smith grabbed a jacket, someone's flight jacket, abandoned on the deck, and wrapped it around his face. He got on his hands and knees to stay below the worst of the smoke. And he crawled toward the tail of the dying bomber. Behind him, the fire continued to spread. Above him, the Focke-Wulfs were coming back. Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith was not supposed to be here. He crawled through the smoke on his hands and knees, the abandoned flight jacket pressed against his face, heat radiating through his sheepskin-lined trousers. Every few feet, he had to stop and bat out flames that caught on his clothing. The deck beneath him was hot enough to feel through his gloves. Burning hydraulic fluid had pooled in the depressions where the aluminum skin was warped, and he crawled through it, leaving smoking handprints behind him. The scream came again, weaker this time. Smith kept crawling. At 32 years old, he was the oldest enlisted man in the 423rd Bombardment Squadron. Most of the gunners were 19, 20, 21. Boys from farms and factories who had never been more than 50 miles from home before Pearl Harbor. Smith had been a drifter, a malcontent, a man who had bounced from job to job across Michigan and Ohio, never staying anywhere long enough to accumulate either friends or responsibilities. When the war came, he had seen it as an escape, an adventure, a chance to prove something he couldn't quite articulate, even to himself. The Army Air Forces had seen him as a problem from the first day. He had arrived at gunnery school in Las Vegas, Nevada, in September 1942 with a chip on his shoulder the size of the Midwest. The instructors called him Snuffy, after the lazy, troublemaking cartoon character Snuffy Smith. And they did not mean it as a compliment. He argued with officers. He showed up late for formations. He questioned orders with a sarcasm that bordered on insubordination. 3 times. Training commanders had recommended him for discharge. 3 times, some combination of clerical oversight and personnel shortage had kept him in uniform. "That man will get himself killed," his primary gunnery instructor had written in an evaluation dated January 15th, 1943. "Or worse, he'll get his crew killed." The evaluation had been accurate about the killing. It had been wrong about who would do the dying. Smith reached the aft bulkhead and found the source of the screaming. Staff Sergeant Roy Gibson, the tail gunner, was slumped against the ammunition feed chute with his left leg bent at an angle that legs do not bend. Blood soaked his flight suit from hip to boot. Shrapnel had torn through the tail section during one of the Fw-190 passes, and Gibson had taken fragments in the thigh, the calf, and the lower abdomen. His face was gray beneath his oxygen mask. His eyes were open but unfocused. "Gibson!" Smith shouted. The name came out muffled through the jacket wrapped around his face. He pulled the jacket away and immediately began coughing. The smoke was thinner here. The open gun port in the tail section was venting some of it, but it was still thick enough to sear his lungs with every breath. Gibson's eyes focused. "Can't feel my leg," he said. His voice was calm, almost conversational. Shock. The man was deep in shock. Smith looked at the leg. The femoral artery ran through the upper thigh. If that artery was severed, Gibson would bleed out in minutes. But the blood on his flight suit was dark, not bright red, and it wasn't pulsing. Venous blood. Survivable if Smith could stop the bleeding. He had no medical training. He had slept through most of the first aid lectures and basic training. But he knew that pressure stopped bleeding, and he knew that cold killed wounded men faster than blood loss. "I'm going to get you out of here," Smith said. He looked around the tail section. The tail gunner's position was a cramped compartment at the very end of the fuselage, barely large enough for one man and his twin .50 caliber guns. Gibson's weapon mount was still intact. the guns pointing out the rear of the aircraft at the empty sky. Ammunition belts snaked from the feed chutes to the guns. The belts were full. Gibson hadn't fired a shot since being wounded. Behind Smith, the fire was still burning in the waist section. He could feel the heat on his back. Building. The aircraft's aluminum skin was designed to withstand temperatures up to 400 degrees Fahrenheit before losing structural integrity. The fire was already past that threshold in places. If the skin failed, the aircraft would break apart. And somewhere out there, the Focke-Wulfs were still circling. Smith grabbed a parachute pack from its rack on the bulkhead. He couldn't evacuate Gibson. The man couldn't walk, couldn't jump, couldn't do anything but lie there and bleed. But the parachute canopy was silk, and silk was warm, and warmth was the difference between a wounded man surviving and a wounded man dying of shock at 22,000 feet. He ripped open the pack and pulled out the folded canopy. White silk billowed in the wind, pouring through the tail gun port. Smith wrapped it around Gibson's body, tucking the edges under his torso, covering him from chest to boots. The wounded man's shivering began to subside. "Stay here," Smith said. It was a stupid thing to say. Where else was Gibson going to go? But it was all he could think of. He turned back toward the waist section. The fire had grown. Flames now covered the entire left side of the fuselage from the ball turret hatch to the radio compartment bulkhead. The right waist gun was still clear, but barely. Smoke was beginning to obscure the mount. The deck was a lake of burning hydraulic fluid, fed by a ruptured line somewhere in the overhead. And in the center of the flames, the ammunition boxes were starting to glow. Each waist gun position held 500 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition in metal boxes. At high enough temperatures, the propellant in those rounds would ignite. The rounds wouldn't fire normally. There was no barrel to contain the pressure. But they would explode. Metal fragments would spray in all directions. 500 rounds exploding in a confined space would kill anyone within 20 feet. There were 1,000 rounds in the waist section. Another 200 rounds in the ammunition storage lockers behind the ball turret hatch. Another 600 rounds feeding Gibson's tail guns. Smith was standing in the middle of 2,800 potential explosions. He didn't think about the odds. He didn't calculate the mathematics of survival. He didn't consider the irony that the Army Air Force's most problematic enlisted man was about to become its most unlikely hero. He grabbed a spare flight jacket from the deck, this one was smoldering at the edges, and started beating at the flames. The fabric caught fire in his hands. He dropped it and grabbed another piece of material, someone's scarf, and tried again. The scarf lasted 4 seconds before disintegrating into ash. He looked around for something, anything, that could help him fight the fire. There was nothing. The backup fire extinguisher, the one that was supposed to be on the aft bulkhead, had been destroyed by cannon fire. Its remains lay in a corner of the waist section, the cylinder punctured by a 20mm shell, the suppressant long since vaporized. Smith had no tools, no equipment, no training for this situation. He had his flight gloves, he had his bare hands, and he had 2,800 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition cooking off around him. The first round exploded at 1411 hours. The sound was sharp, like a firecracker, and something hot sliced past Smith's ear, close enough to feel the wind of its passage. A fragment of brass casing embedded itself in the bulkhead 2 feet from his head. He ducked instinctively, pressing himself against the deck, his cheek against warm aluminum. Another round exploded, then another. The popping sounds were irregular, random, dependent on which rounds reached ignition temperature first. Each explosion sent fragments in unpredictable directions. Each explosion could kill him. Smith looked at the ammunition boxes. The metal was glowing cherry red. In seconds, the rounds inside would reach critical temperature and the entire box would go up at once. Not individual pops, but a single catastrophic detonation. He had to get that ammunition out of the aircraft. He stood up. Rounds were still cooking off around him, one every few seconds now, the rate increasing as the fire spread. He crossed to the port waist gun position in 3 steps, grabbed the burning ammunition box with both hands, and lifted. The heat went through his flight gloves like they weren't there. He felt his palms begin to blister immediately, felt the flesh of his fingers searing against the metal handles. The box weighed 43 pounds. It felt like 1,000. He carried it to the starboard waist door and threw it out of the aircraft. The box tumbled into the sky, trailing smoke, and disappeared into the clouds 22,000 feet above France. Rounds were still exploding inside it as it fell. In 3 minutes, it would impact a farmer's field outside Saint-Nazaire and scatter unexploded ordnance across a quarter acre. Smith turned back for the next box. His gloves were smoking. The leather was charred black. He could smell his own flesh burning. A sickly sweet odor that mixed with the chemical stench of the fire. He didn't take the gloves off. If he took them off, he would see his hands. And if he saw his hands, he might stop. He couldn't stop. The second ammunition box was heavier than the first, more rounds remaining. Smith's burned hands screamed as he gripped the handles. He lifted, staggered toward the open door, and threw the box into the sky. Behind him, the fire was still spreading. Above him, the Focke-Wulfs were diving again. The first 20mm cannon shell hit the fuselage 6 feet from Smith's head. He felt the impact through the deck, heard the aluminum tear, saw a hole appear in the bulkhead the size of a dinner plate. Freezing air poured through the hole, mixing with the heat of the fire, creating a swirling chaos of temperature and pressure that made his head spin. Smith looked out the starboard waist door and saw them. 3 Fw-190A-4s in echelon formation, coming around for another pass, their propellers catching the afternoon sun. Cannon flashes sparkled along their wings. More holes appeared in the fuselage, stitching a line across the ceiling. He had a choice. He could keep fighting the fire, keep throwing ammunition boxes out of the aircraft, keep trying to save the bomber and everyone still aboard. Or he could man the waist guns and try to drive off the fighters who were systematically destroying what was left of Werewolf. He couldn't do both. He couldn't do either one alone. But there was no one else. Smith grabbed the starboard waist gun, swung it toward the approaching fighters, and pressed the trigger. The M2 Browning roared to life, spitting 50 caliber rounds at 800 per minute. Tracers arced across the sky toward the lead Fw-190. The German pilot broke right, pulling his aircraft into a steep bank that took him out of Smith's field of fire. The second fighter followed. The third pilot held his course for 2 more seconds, cannon shells walking across Werewolf's starboard wing before breaking off. Smith released the trigger. The gun fell silent. Behind him, the fire crackled and popped. More ammunition was cooking off. The temperature in the waist section had risen by at least 20 degrees in the last 30 seconds. He had driven off the fighters. For now. He turned back to the fire. There were still 6 ammunition boxes in the waist section, 6 boxes, 3,000 rounds, all of them heating toward explosion. His hands were burned, his lungs were full of smoke, and his crewmates were either dead, wounded, or gone. It was 14 hours. He had been fighting alone for 7 minutes. The mission had 73 minutes left. Smith grabbed the third ammunition box. The metal was hotter than the first two. The fire had been working on it longer. His flight gloves had burned through in 3 places, and he could feel the raw flesh of his palms pressing directly against the superheated steel. The pain was beyond anything he had experienced in his 32 years. It was clarifying. It reduced the world to a single imperative: lift, carry, throw. He lifted. The box came up from the deck with a grinding sound. Rounds were cooking off inside it. He could hear them popping like corn in a skillet, could feel the vibrations through the metal. If the box went up while he was holding it, there would be nothing left of his hands, nothing left of his arms, probably nothing left of his chest. He carried 4 steps to the open waste door. Each step on burning hydraulic fluid, each step through smoke thick enough to taste. His lungs were screaming for oxygen. At 22,000 feet, the air contained only 40% of the oxygen available at sea level, and what oxygen remained was being consumed by the fire. He was suffocating and burning simultaneously. He threw. The box tumbled into the sky. Rounds exploded inside it as it fell, tiny flashes of light against the gray clouds below. Smith watched it disappear for perhaps half a second. Half a second of rest, half a second of not lifting, not carrying, not burning. Then he turned back for the 4th box. The fire had spread while he'd been at the door. Flames now licked at the starboard side of the fuselage, eating through the fabric covering that protected the aluminum skin. The fabric was supposed to be fire-resistant. The manufacturer had apparently not tested it against Luftwaffe cannon fire and ruptured hydraulic lines. Smith crossed to the 4th box. This one was against the port bulkhead, wedged behind the waist gun mount. He had to reach through flames to grip the handles. He did it without hesitation, what was a little more burning at this point, and dragged the box free. Lift, carry, throw. The box went out the door. 4 down, 4 remaining. He reached for the 5th box. The Focke-Wulfs came back. He heard them before he saw them. The distinctive sound of BMW 801 radial engines at full power, a deep, thrumming growl that cut through the roar of fire and wind. He looked out the starboard waist door and saw 3 angular silhouettes rising from below, climbing up through the clouds toward Werewolf's belly. They had learned from the last pass. Instead of approaching from behind, where the waist guns could track them, they were coming from directly below and ahead. From the one angle where Smith couldn't bring a gun to bear without leaving the waist section entirely. He watched them climb. He had perhaps 8 seconds before they reached firing range. 8 seconds. He grabbed the 5th ammunition box, ignored the screaming of his hands, and threw it out the door in one continuous motion. 6 seconds. He lunged for the 6th box, the one wedged under the ball turret hatch. 4 seconds. The metal was so hot it glowed, and when he grabbed it, he heard a sizzling sound and realized it was his flesh cooking against the steel. 2 seconds. He threw the box. The Focke-Wulfs opened fire. Cannon shells ripped through the floor of the B-17. One shell passed between Smith's legs, missing his right boot by 3 inches, and punched through the ceiling above his head. Another shell detonated against the ball turret mechanism, destroying the azimuth motor and sending shrapnel in all directions. A fragment the size of a quarter embedded itself in Smith's left thigh. He didn't feel it. The burn pain had overwhelmed everything else. The shrapnel was just another injury in a body that had become a catalog of damage. The fighters passed beneath the bomber and pulled up ahead, already curving around for another attack. Smith watched them go. He was panting, hyperventilating, his body trying desperately to extract oxygen from air that contained almost none. 6 ammunition boxes overboard, 2 remaining, plus the 600 rounds feeding the tail guns, plus whatever was left in the waist gun magazines, plus the fire. Smith turned away from the door and faced the flames. The fire had grown while he'd been throwing ammunition. It now covered perhaps 60% of the waist section. The port waist gun was completely engulfed. Useless, its ammunition already cooking off in sporadic pops and cracks. The radio compartment forward was a solid wall of orange flame. The only clear space was a shrinking island around the starboard waist gun and the passage to the tail section. If the fire reached the tail section, Gibson was dead. If the fire reached the fuel tanks and the wings, everyone was dead. If the fire burned through the fuselage skin, the aircraft would break apart and everyone would be dead regardless. Smith had no fire extinguisher. He had no water. He had no foam, no sand, no blankets, no tools of any kind designed for fighting fires. He had his body. He stripped off what remained of his flight jacket. The leather was charred and smoking, and began beating at the flames along the starboard bulkhead. The jacket caught fire almost immediately. He kept swinging it, kept slapping at the base of the flames, kept trying to smother what couldn't be smothered. The jacket disintegrated in his hands. He grabbed a piece of debris from the deck, a section of aluminum skin torn loose by cannon fire, and tried using it as a shield, a barrier between the fire and the passage to the tail section. The metal was too thin. It heated up in seconds, turned from silver to cherry red, and he had to drop it before it burned through what was left of his gloves. Smoke was everywhere now. He couldn't see more than 3 feet in any direction. His eyes streamed tears that evaporated in the heat. His throat felt like he'd swallowed razor blades. Every breath was a negotiation with pain. He heard Gibson coughing from the tail section. The smoke was reaching the wounded man. If Gibson couldn't breathe, if his damaged lungs filled with smoke, he would die before the fire ever touched him. Smith dropped to his hands and knees. The air was marginally clearer near the deck, and crawled toward the tail. The deck was hot enough to scorch through his trousers. He could feel blisters forming on his knees, his shins, his palms. He kept crawling. He reached Gibson in perhaps 15 seconds. The tail gunner was conscious, barely, his eyes wide and glassy above the oxygen mask. The mask was still connected to the aircraft's oxygen system, but the system had been damaged. The gauge showed only 200 psi remaining, maybe 10 minutes of breathable air. "Hang on," Smith said. The words came out as a croak, barely audible. He checked the parachute silk wrapped around Gibson's body. It was still in place, still providing insulation, but the edges were starting to smolder. In another few minutes, the wounded man would be wrapped in a burning shroud. Smith had to get the fire under control. He had to get back to the waist section. He had to somehow extinguish flames that were spreading faster than he could contain them. He started crawling back. Halfway to the waist guns, he heard the Focke-Wulfs again. This time they came from behind, from the tail, from the one section of sky that only the tail guns could cover. Gibson's guns. The guns that Gibson couldn't fire because Gibson was lying on the deck, wrapped in parachute silk with a shattered leg and shrapnel in his abdomen. Smith heard the cannon shells impact the tail section. He heard Gibson scream, a short, sharp sound, cut off almost immediately. He heard metal tearing, rivets popping, the entire rear of the aircraft shuddering under the assault. Then the fighters were past, and there was only the crackle of flames. Smith crawled back to the tail section. Gibson was still alive. A new wound had opened on his right arm, another shrapnel fragment. But the arterial blood was still dark, still venous, still survivable. The parachute silk was torn in 3 places, but intact. The tail guns were undamaged. The tail guns. Smith looked at them. Twin .50 calibers, fully loaded, pointing out the back of the aircraft at the empty sky. The fighters had come from that direction once. They would come from that direction again. He couldn't be in two places at once. He couldn't fight the fire in the waist section and defend the tail section simultaneously. He couldn't save Gibson and save the aircraft and save himself. But the fighters didn't know that. The fighters saw a B-17 with guns at every position. They saw a fortress. That was what the propaganda called it, a flying fortress, bristling with weapons. They didn't know that the fortress had been gutted, that half the crew was gone, that one man was trying to do the work of 6. If Smith could man those tail guns, even for a few seconds, he could drive the fighters away. He could buy time. Time to fight the fire. Time to stabilize Gibson. Time to do something, anything, that might keep this aircraft in the sky. He climbed over Gibson's body, carefully, so carefully, trying not to jostle the wounded leg, and positioned himself behind the tail guns. The controls were simple. A spade grip for each gun, a trigger for each thumb, a ring and bead sight for aiming. The guns had an effective range of 600 yards and a maximum range of over a mile. They could fire 800 rounds per minute each, and 600 rounds combined, a stream of death that could shred an Fw-190 in a 2-second burst. Smith checked the ammunition belts. Full. 600 rounds total, already threaded through the feed mechanism, ready to fire. He waited. The sky behind the B-17 was a bowl of gray clouds and blue sky patches. The formation had scattered. Smith could see other bombers in the distance, some trailing smoke, some seemingly untouched. All of them heading back toward England. Werewolf was alone, straggling behind the formation, an easy target for any fighter pilot looking for a kill. They would come. They would come from behind, from below, from the one angle where a straggler was most vulnerable. They would come fast, diving at over 400 miles per hour, cannons blazing. They would expect the tail guns to be silent, the gunner dead or wounded, the aircraft defenseless. They would not expect Maynard Harrison Smith. At 14:21 hours, the Focke-Wulfs came back. Smith saw them as specks against the clouds, 3 miles away, closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. He tracked them with the ring sight, watched them grow from specks to silhouettes to recognizable aircraft. He could see the black crosses on their wings, the yellow noses that marked them as JG-2. The gun ports in their wings where the 20mm cannons waited. He held his fire. At 1,000 yards, the lead fighter opened up. Tracers arced toward Werewolf, passing to the left, the pilot still finding his range. Smith watched the tracers without flinching. If he fired now, at this distance, he would waste ammunition and reveal his position without scoring a hit. At 600 yards, the tracers found the mark. Cannon shells punched through the already shredded tail section, passing over Smith's head, smashing what remained of the rear bulkhead. Gibson whimpered somewhere below him. At 400 yards, Smith pressed both triggers. The twin 50s roared. Tracers streamed toward the lead Focke-Wulf in an unbroken river of light. The German pilot hadn't expected return fire. Smith saw the aircraft lurch, saw the nose dip as the pilot instinctively pushed forward on the stick, saw pieces fly from the engine cowling as his round struck home. The Fw-190 rolled left and dove away, smoke trailing from its engine. The second fighter broke right before reaching effective range, unwilling to fly into the stream of tracers that had just damaged his flight leader. The third fighter followed, and in seconds, all three were curving away, climbing back up to altitude, reforming for another approach. Smith released the triggers. He had fired perhaps 80 rounds. He had 520 remaining. And behind him, The fire was still burning. He climbed back over Gibson, pausing only to check the man's pulse, weak but steady, and headed for the waist section. The smoke hit him like a wall. The heat was worse than before. The fire had spread while he was at the tail guns, consuming another 5 feet of fuselage, creeping ever closer to the passage that connected the waist section to the tail. If that passage burned through, he and Gibson would be cut off. They would be trapped in the tail section with nothing but a wounded man, 25 rounds of ammunition, and 22,000 feet of empty air beneath them. Smith grabbed what was left of his flight jacket from the deck, a scorched rag barely recognizable, and began beating at the flames again. If you want to see how Smith survived the next 70 minutes, 70 minutes of fire and fighters and a bomber coming apart around him, hit that subscribe button right now. It tells YouTube to share these stories with more people who need to hear them. The fire reached the 7th ammunition box. Smith saw the metal begin to glow. He dropped the remnants of his jacket and lunged for the box, his burned hands screaming in protest. The handles were too hot to grip. He could smell his flesh searing, but he grabbed them anyway, lifted the box, and stumbled toward the open waist door. The box exploded in his hands. The explosion threw Smith backward. Not a massive detonation. The rounds inside the box went off in a rapid sequence, perhaps 15 or 20 in the span of a single second, each one a small contained blast that sent fragments in random directions. The combined force was enough to rip the box from his grip and knock him off his feet. He hit the deck hard, his back slamming against the starboard bulkhead. Something sharp jabbed into his hip. A piece of shrapnel, a rivet, a fragment of the box itself. He didn't know. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. His vision blurred, doubled, slowly resolved into a smoke-filled nightmare. He looked at his hands. The flight gloves were gone. Not burned through, gone, vaporized, torn away by the blast. What remained was barely recognizable as human. His palms were a patchwork of red and black. The red was raw flesh, exposed dermis, tissue that had never been meant to see air. The black was char, burned skin that had crisped and cracked like overcooked meat. Blisters the size of quarters had formed between his fingers, filled with clear fluid that leaked onto the deck. The hair on the backs of his hands had burned away, leaving smooth pink skin that was already beginning to blister. He could see bone. On his right hand, in the webbing between his thumb and index finger, the flesh had been torn away to reveal something white beneath. Not bright white, a yellowish, greasy white, the color of old ivory. He was looking at his own metacarpal, the bone that connected his thumb to his wrist, and his first thought was not pain, not horror, but a strange, detached curiosity. So that's what I look like inside. Then the pain hit. It came in a wave, a tsunami of agony that started in his hands and radiated up his arms, through his shoulders, into his chest. It was not like any pain he had experienced before. It was not sharp, not dull, not throbbing. It was everything at once, a symphony of nerve endings screaming in unison, a choir of damaged tissue singing the same note at maximum volume. Smith screamed. He screamed for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he stopped. Not because the pain had lessened. The pain had not lessened, would not lessen for hours, would not fully leave him for the rest of his life, but because screaming accomplished nothing. Screaming used oxygen he didn't have. Screaming used time he couldn't spare. The fire was still burning. He looked at the 7th ammunition box. The explosion had scattered it across the waist section. The box itself was a twisted piece of metal lodged against the ball turret hatch, and the rounds that hadn't detonated were spread across the deck in a glittering constellation of brass and copper. Rounds that were still heating up. Rounds that would still explode. Smith got to his knees. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through his hands, and he had to close his eyes and breathe through clenched teeth until the worst of it passed. When he opened his eyes, he could see individual rounds beginning to glow. The fire had reached them. In seconds, they would cook off. He had no gloves. He had no protection. He had 2 burned, bleeding, ruined hands and a deck full of live ammunition about to explode. He started picking up the rounds. The first one was warm but not hot, maybe 150 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature of a fresh cup of coffee. He closed his fingers around it and felt the brass press against his exposed flesh. The pain was immediate and intense, but it was manageable. He threw the round out the open waist door and reached for the next one. The second round was hotter, 200 degrees, maybe 250. Steam rose from his palm as bodily fluids vaporized against the metal. The smell of cooking meat, his meat, filled his nostrils. He threw the round and reached for another. The third round burned him. Not the gradual burn of the first 2, a searing, instant burn that made his hand convulse involuntarily. The round slipped from his fingers, bounced on the deck, and rolled toward the fire. Smith lunged after it, grabbed it again, felt fresh skin stick to the brass and tear away as he threw it out the door. He reached for the 4th round. This one was glowing. Not bright orange, not cherry red, but a dull amber that indicated temperatures approaching 400 degrees Fahrenheit. The propellant inside the cartridge would ignite at approximately 450 degrees. He had seconds. He picked it up. The pain was beyond description. It was beyond words. It was a white-hot lance that shot from his palm to his elbow, to his shoulder, to his brain. His vision went dark at the edges. His body tried to drop the round, to pull away from the source of the agony, but he forced his fingers to stay closed. He threw the round. He watched it tumble through the air, trailing smoke, and disappear out the waist door. It had been in his hand for perhaps 1 second. 1 second of contact with metal hot enough to ignite gunpowder. 1 second of flesh pressing against brass that was 30 degrees away from explosion. 1 second that had cost him a layer of skin he would never get back. There were more rounds. Dozens more. Scattered across the deck, rolling into corners, lodging against debris. Each one was heating up. Each one was a few degrees closer to detonation. Each one had to be picked up, with hands that were already destroyed, and thrown out of the aircraft. Smith crawled across the deck. He found rounds by touch as much as by sight. The smoke was too thick to see clearly, but he could feel the heat radiating from the brass even before his fingers made contact. He picked them up one by one, 2 by 2 when they were close together, and threw them out the door with a sidearm motion that had become mechanical, automatic, divorced from conscious thought. He lost count after 30. Some of the rounds exploded before he could reach them. Small pops that sent fragments whizzing past his head, his shoulders, his legs. One fragment opened a gash on his forehead, and blood began streaming into his left eye, half blinding him. He wiped the blood away with the back of his wrist, the least damaged part of his hands, and kept crawling. He found a cluster of rounds near the port waist gun mount. They were piled together, perhaps 8 or 10 of them, all glowing amber. There was no time to pick them up individually. There was no time to throw them one at a time. Smith cupped his hands together, what remained of his hands, and scooped the entire cluster. The pain dropped him to his knees. He stayed down for perhaps 2 seconds, his hands full of glowing ammunition, his nervous system overloading, his brain trying to force him to drop the rounds and save what was left of his flesh. He could feel the heat penetrating through his palms, through his fingers, into the bones beneath. He could feel the blisters forming in real time, could feel the fluid building between the layers of his skin. He stood up. He walked to the waist door. He threw the rounds into the sky. Then he fell against the fuselage and slid down to the deck, his back against the aluminum, his ruined hands cradled against his chest. And he allowed himself 5 seconds of stillness. 5 seconds of not moving, not fighting, not burning. The fire crackled. Smoke swirled. Somewhere aft, Gibson coughed weakly. 5 seconds ended. Smith pushed himself back to his feet and looked for more ammunition. The deck was clear, or as clear as it was going to get. A few scattered rounds remained in corners and crevices, but they were isolated, unlikely to cause a chain reaction. The larger danger had passed. He had thrown perhaps 60 rounds overboard, most of them hot enough to burn through leather, a dozen of them hot enough to burn through flesh. But the fire was still spreading. The port side of the waist section was fully engulfed now. Flames climbed the bulkhead, licked at the ceiling, reached for the radio compartment forward. The heat was intense enough that Smith's exposed skin, his face, his neck, his forearms where his sleeves had burned away, felt like it was blistering from radiant heat alone. And he could hear the engines changing pitch. The number 3 engine, the inboard engine on the starboard wing, was sputtering. The sound was irregular, coughing, the unmistakable rhythm of fuel starvation or mechanical damage. If that engine failed, Werewolf would lose a quarter of its power. The aircraft would slow, it would struggle to maintain altitude. It would fall even further behind the formation. It would become even more of a target. Smith moved toward the forward bulkhead. The fire was hottest here, flames reaching from floor to ceiling. But beyond the fire was the radio compartment. And beyond the radio compartment was the bomb bay. And beyond the bomb bay was the cockpit where the pilot and co-pilot were fighting to keep the aircraft in the air. He needed to tell them about the fire. He needed to tell them about Gibson. He needed to know if anyone else was still alive. The flames blocked his path. The heat was too intense to push through. He could see the radio compartment door on the other side of the inferno, closed, intact, possibly protecting the forward crew from the fire consuming the rear of the aircraft. But he couldn't reach it. He was trapped. He and Gibson were cut off from the rest of the crew, isolated in the burning tail section of a dying bomber. With German fighters still circling and 70 minutes of flight time between them and England. At 14:28 hours, the number 3 engine quit. The sputtering stopped. The propeller windmilled to a halt. The asymmetric thrust pulled Werewolf to the right, and Smith felt the deck tilt beneath his feet as the pilot fought to compensate. 3 engines now. 3 engines, a burning fuselage, a wounded tail gunner, and 1 ball turret gunner with destroyed hands, who was trying to do the work of 6 men. Smith looked at the fire. He looked at his hands. He began beating at the flames with his forearms. The sleeves of his flight suit caught fire almost immediately. He felt the heat against his skin. More heat, always more heat, and kept swinging. His forearms were relatively undamaged compared to his hands. The skin there was pink and blistered, but intact. It could take a few more burns. It had to take a few more burns. He beat at the flames along the passage to the tail section. This was the critical point. If the fire crossed this threshold, Gibson was dead. Smith would be trapped in the waist section with no retreat, no escape, nothing but fire in all directions. He beat until his sleeves were charred rags. He beat until the hair on his arms was gone. He beat until the flames along the passage died down. Not out, but down. Reduced to smoldering embers and glowing aluminum. Then he fell back against the starboard bulkhead and tried to catch his breath. The oxygen was almost gone. The fire had consumed most of it, and what remained was thin and hot and tasted like burned metal. Smith's lungs ached. His vision was narrowing, the edges going gray. He was suffocating, slowly, even as he burned. He needed air. He crawled to the starboard waist door, the door he'd been throwing ammunition through, the door that opened onto 22,000 feet of empty sky, and stuck his head out into the slipstream. The cold hit him like a fist. Minus 40 degrees, screaming past at 180 miles per hour, freezing the sweat on his face, the blood on his forehead, the fluid leaking from his blistered hands. But it was air. Clean air, cold air, oxygen-rich air that flooded his lungs and pushed back the gray at the edges of his vision. He breathed. He counted to 5. He pulled his head back inside and got to work. At 14:31 hours, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith established a routine. It was not a routine anyone had trained him for. It was not a routine that existed in any Army Air Forces manual, any gunnery school curriculum, any tactical doctrine. It was a routine born of desperation, improvised in real time by a man who had nearly washed out of training 3 times and was now the only functioning crew member in the rear half of a burning B-17. The routine went like this. Fight the fire for 90 seconds. Check on Gibson. Return to the fire. Listen for fighters. Man the guns when they came. Return to the fire. Check on Gibson. Return to the fire. Repeat until dead or home. Smith worked on the fire with whatever he could find. His flight jacket was gone. His gloves were gone. Most of his sleeves were gone. He tore strips from his trousers. The thick wool of the flight suit was slightly more fire-resistant than the leather, and used them to smother small patches of flame. When the strips burned through, he tore more strips. When his trousers were reduced to shorts, he started on Gibson's abandoned gear. The fire would not die. Every time he beat down one section of flames, another section flared up. The hydraulic fluid continued to leak from the ruptured line somewhere in the overhead, feeding the fire with a steady trickle of flammable liquid. Smith couldn't reach the line to stop it. He couldn't see the line through the smoke. All he could do was fight the symptoms while the disease continued unchecked. At 14:34 hours, he checked on Gibson. The tail gunner was alive, but fading. His pulse was weaker than before. Smith could barely feel it against his destroyed fingertips. His breathing was shallow, rapid, the respiration of a man whose body was starting to shut down. The wounds in his leg and abdomen were still bleeding, slowly but steadily, and the parachute silk wrapped around him was stained dark red. Smith had no morphine. The medical kit was in the radio compartment on the other side of the fire, as unreachable as the moon. He had no bandages, no sulfa powder, no plasma, no tools of any kind to stop the bleeding or ease the pain. He had his voice. "Stay with me," he said. The words came out as a croak, his throat raw from smoke and heat. "We're going home. You hear me? We're going home." Gibson's eyes flickered. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Smith adjusted the parachute silk, tucking the edges tighter, trying to preserve what body heat remained. He checked the oxygen gauge. 150 psi, maybe 7 minutes of breathable air. After that, Gibson would be breathing smoke. "I'll be back," Smith said. "Keep breathing. That's all you have to do. Just keep breathing." He returned to the fire. At 14:37 hours, the Focke-Wulfs came back. Smith heard them before he saw them, that distinctive BMW growl approaching from the northeast, from the direction of the French coast they had bombed just 40 minutes earlier. He left the burning waist section and scrambled back to the tail guns, climbing over Gibson's still form, settling himself behind the twin 50s. 3 fighters. Same 3 fighters, or different 3, he couldn't tell. They all looked the same, angular silhouettes with radial engines and yellow noses. The markings of Jagdgeschwader II, the Richthofen fighter wing that had been killing American bombers since the 8th Air Force's first mission. They came in from the left rear quarter, staggered vertically so that each pilot had a clear field of fire. Professional formation, experienced pilots. Men who had probably shot down a dozen bombers between them. Smith tracked the lead fighter with his ring sight. At 500 yards, the Focke-Wulfs opened fire. Cannon shells and machine gun rounds streamed toward Werwolf, converging on the tail section where Smith crouched behind his guns. He heard the impacts, the deep thud of 20mm shells, the sharper crack of 7.92mm bullets, and felt the airframe shudder around him. At 350 yards, he fired back. The twin 50s roared, spitting tracers at 600 rounds per minute combined. Smith walked his fire across the lead Fw-190, saw sparks fly from the engine cowling, saw the propeller stutter and a stream of dark smoke erupt from the exhaust stacks. The lead fighter broke off, diving away, trailing smoke and fire. But the second fighter held his course. Cannon shells punched through what remained of the tail section. One shell exploded 3 feet from Smith's head, spraying fragments across the compartment. He felt something hot slice across his left shoulder. Not deep, just a graze, but enough to add another wound to the catalog. He kept firing. The second fighter flashed past, so close that Smith could see the pilot's face behind the armored glass. Young, blonde, expressionless. A man doing his job, trying to kill Smith the same way Smith was trying to kill him. The third fighter broke off without pressing his attack. Perhaps he'd seen what happened to the first 2. Perhaps his ammunition was running low. Perhaps he simply didn't want to fly through the stream of tracers that had already damaged 2 of his wingmen. Whatever the reason, the 3 Fw-190s curved away, climbing back toward France, disappearing into the gray clouds. Smith released the triggers and checked his ammunition, 380 rounds remaining. He climbed back over Gibson and returned to the fire. At 1442 hours, he found the hydraulic leak. It was in the overhead, just as he'd suspected, a line running from the main hydraulic reservoir to the tailwheel assembly, severed by a cannon shell fragment and dripping fluid at a rate of perhaps a quart per minute. The fluid fell directly onto a section of smoldering insulation, reigniting every time Smith beat down the flames. He needed to stop the leak. His hands were useless for fine work. The burns had destroyed his dexterity. He could barely close his fingers, let alone grip a small hydraulic line and crimp it shut. He needed tools. He needed pliers, wire, tape, anything that could pinch the line closed. He had none of those things. He looked at the line. He looked at his hands. He looked at the fire spreading beneath the steady drip of hydraulic fluid. Then he reached up, grabbed the line in his fist, and bent it. The aluminum tubing was designed to withstand pressures of over 1/500 psi. It was not designed to be bent by human hands. But the cannon fragment that had severed it had also weakened it. And Smith's grip, the grip of a man whose pain receptors had overloaded and stopped sending coherent signals, was driven by desperation rather than strength. The line bent, not cleanly, not completely, but enough. The drip slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. The fluid pooled in the bent section, backed up toward the reservoir, no longer feeding the flames. Smith released the line and looked at his hands. Fresh blood was seeping from the cracks in his charred skin. The effort of bending the line had torn open blisters and reopened wounds. His palms looked like raw hamburger meat, mottled red and black, glistening with fluid. He didn't care. The fire was no longer being fed. He grabbed a piece of scorched fabric, what was left of someone's flight suit abandoned on the deck, and began smothering the remaining flames. Without the constant drip of hydraulic fluid, the fire finally started to die. The flames shrank, receded, reduced themselves to smoldering patches and glowing embers. At 14:48 hours, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith extinguished the fire in the waist section of B-17F Werewolf. He stood in the center of the ruined compartment, swaying slightly, surveying his work. The port side of the fuselage was charred black, the aluminum skin warped and buckled from heat stress. Holes dotted the walls, ceiling, and floor. Hundreds of holes, some the size of fists, some the size of dinner plates, all of them admitting freezing air and gray light. The waist guns hung in their mounts, the port gun destroyed, the starboard gun still functional. The deck was covered in debris. Spent shell casings, torn fabric, fragments of equipment, the detritus of combat. But the fire was out. Smith allowed himself 3 seconds of satisfaction. Then he heard the engines change pitch again. The number 2 engine, the outboard engine on the port wing, was running rough. Not the steady rhythm of a healthy Wright R-1820 Cyclone, but an irregular beat, a mechanical arrhythmia that signaled damage or fuel starvation, or both. Werewolf was down to 3 engines, one of them struggling, and they were still 40 minutes from England. 40 minutes. Smith checked on Gibson. The tail gunner was unconscious now. His pulse was thready, barely detectable, his breathing shallow and irregular. The oxygen gauge read 80 psi. Maybe 4 minutes of breathable air remaining. After that, Gibson would be inhaling smoke and combustion gases. Smith looked at the gauge. He looked at Gibson. He looked at the waist section, still hazy with smoke despite the fire being out. The smoke was the problem. The fire was out, but the smoke remained. Trapped in the fuselage, poisoning the air. Gibson needed clean air. The aircraft was full of holes, hundreds of holes, but the smoke wasn't venting fast enough. Smith needed to create ventilation. He moved to the port waist gun position. The gun was destroyed. The mount twisted, the barrel bent, the mechanism jammed. But the gun port was intact. It was a rectangular opening in the fuselage, maybe 18 inches by 12 inches, designed to allow the gun to traverse through a wide arc. Smith grabbed the edges of the port and pulled. The aluminum was weakened by heat. It tore like paper, the edges peeling back, enlarging the opening. He pulled again, widening it further, creating a gap 3 feet wide where there had been an 18-inch gun port. Cold air rushed in. The temperature in the waist section dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Smoke began streaming out through the new opening, replaced by clean, cold, oxygen-rich air from outside. The haze started to clear. Smith moved to another section of weakened skin and tore it open. Then another. Then another. He was dismantling the fuselage with his bare hands, creating ventilation holes in an aircraft that already had hundreds of holes. But these holes were where he needed them. Positioned to create airflow through the waist section, pulling smoke out and bringing fresh air in. By 14:55 hours, the smoke had cleared enough that he could see from the waist section to the tail section without obstruction. He checked on Gibson again. The tail gunner was still unconscious, but his breathing was steadier now, deeper, more regular, responding to the improved air quality. The oxygen gauge read 50 psi, but the external air was breathable at 22,000 feet, barely, and it was better than smoke. Gibson was still alive. The fire was out. The smoke was clearing. Werewolf was still flying. And the Focke-Wulfs came back. At 14:59 hours, 4 fighters appeared on the horizon behind the bomber. Not 3 this time, 4. A full swarm, the standard Luftwaffe tactical formation. They were higher than before, maybe 25,000 feet, positioning themselves for a diving attack that would carry them through the bomber formation and away before the American gunners could react. But there was no bomber formation, not anymore. Werewolf had fallen too far behind, was too damaged, too slow. The bomber was alone, straggling over the channel, an easy target for pilots looking to add to their kill tallies. Smith settled himself behind the tail guns. 360 rounds remaining. The Fw-190s began their dive. They came down like stooping hawks, 4 abreast, their engines screaming at full power. At this angle, diving from above and behind, they were closing at over 500 miles per hour, giving Smith perhaps 4 seconds from the moment they entered range until the moment they flashed past. 4 seconds. He waited. The lead fighter opened fire at 600 yards. Tracers streamed past Werewolf's tail, the pilot's aim thrown off by the dive angle, but correcting, walking toward the bomber with each passing instant. At 400 yards, Smith fired. He didn't aim at the lead fighter. The angle was too steep, the deflection too difficult to calculate. He aimed at the second fighter, the wingman, the pilot who would be focused on maintaining formation rather than evading. His tracers struck the F-190 in the engine cowling. The fighter exploded. It was not a dramatic movie explosion, no fireball, no sound effect. The round simply tore through the BMW 801 radial engine, severed fuel lines, and ignited hydraulic fluid, and the fighter disintegrated into a cloud of aluminum fragments and black smoke. One moment there was an aircraft. The next moment there was debris spreading across the sky in an expanding sphere. The pilot never had time to bail out. The remaining 3 fighters scattered, their formation broken by the explosion of their comrade. They pulled up, curved away, reformed at a safe distance. Smith tracked them with his guns but held his fire. They were out of range now, circling, assessing. They had expected an easy kill. They had not expected resistance. They had not expected Snuffy Smith. For 30 seconds, the fighters circled. Smith watched them through his ring sight, his fingers on the triggers, waiting. Then they turned east, toward France, toward home. Smith watched them disappear into the gray clouds, and for the first time in nearly an hour, the sky behind Werewolf was empty. He checked his ammunition. 290 rounds remaining. He checked on Gibson. Still alive. Still unconscious. Still wrapped in blood-stained parachute silk. He returned to the waist section. The fire was out. The smoke was clearing. The fighters were gone. But Werewolf was still dying. At 15:03 hours, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith made contact with the cockpit. The intercom was dead, had been dead since the first fighter pass, but the aircraft's internal phone system, a separate circuit running through armored conduit along the fuselage spine, was still functional. Smith found the handset hanging from its bracket near the starboard waist gun, lifted it to his ear, and pressed the transmit button with what remained of his thumb. "Cockpit, this is waist. Do you copy?" Static. Then a voice, thin and crackling. "Jesus Christ, who is this?" "Smith. Ball turret. I'm in the waist section." A pause. "Smith, where the hell is everyone? We've been calling for 20 minutes. Radio's dead. Intercom's dead. We thought everyone back there was..." "Gibson's alive," Smith interrupted. "Wounded bad. Everyone else bailed or is gone. The fire's out. I need to know our situation." Another pause. Longer this time. Smith could hear voices in the background. The pilot and co-pilot conferring, their words unintelligible through the static. The voice came back. We're at 19,000 feet descending. Number 3 is out. Number 2 is losing oil pressure. We give it maybe 10 more minutes. Number 1 and 4 are holding, but we're burning fuel fast. Navigator says we're 43 miles from the English coast. 32 minutes at current airspeed. Smith did the math. Number 2 engine failing in 10 minutes. 32 minutes to the coast. 22 minutes of flying on 2 engines with a burning B-17 that had already lost half its structural integrity. What about fighters? He asked. Last group broke off about 5 minutes ago. We're getting close to Spitfire range. Krauts don't like coming this far west. But we're not out of the woods yet. Roger. I'll keep the tail guns manned. What's our landing situation? The pause this time was longer. When the voice came back, it was quieter. Landing gear might not extend. Hydraulics are shot. We've got manual backup, but it's a crank system. Takes 2 men to operate, and we can't spare anyone from the cockpit. If we can't get the gear down, we're going to have to belly in. A belly landing. No wheels, no shock absorption. Just the aluminum skin of the fuselage grinding across a runway at 100 miles per hour. In a normal B-17, a belly landing was survivable. Dangerous, but survivable. In a B-17 that had been shot to pieces, burned from the inside, and was held together by hope and habit. A belly landing was a death sentence. Where's the manual crank? Smith asked. Forward bomb bay. Starboard side. You'll see the access panel. I'll get the gear down. Smith, your hands. I'll get the gear down. Just keep us in the air. He hung up the handset and looked at the forward bulkhead. The fire was out, but the passage to the radio compartment was still blocked by wreckage. The radio operator's station, the compartment between the waist section and the bomb bay, had taken multiple cannon hits during the fighter attacks. The door was jammed, wedged shut by bent aluminum, and the bulkhead around it was warped from heat stress. Smith would have to go through it. He crossed to the door and examined the damage. The aluminum frame had buckled inward, pinching the door in its track. He could see a gap at the top, maybe 8 inches, where the warping had pulled the door away from the frame. Not big enough to climb through? Not yet. He grabbed the edge of the door with both hands and pulled. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. His burned palms pressed against bare metal, his exposed nerve endings screaming in protest. The blisters on his fingers burst, leaking fluid that sizzled against the cold aluminum. He felt something tear in his right hand, a section of char pulling away from the flesh beneath, and fresh blood began dripping onto the deck. The door didn't move. Smith released his grip and looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, but from simple physiological overload. His body was beginning to fail. The adrenaline that had carried him through the last hour was fading. And in its place was exhaustion, pain, and the creeping weakness of blood loss and oxygen deprivation. He couldn't open the door with his hands. He looked around the waist section for something to use as a lever. A piece of debris, a section of gun mount, anything rigid enough to pry the door open. He found the ammunition feed chute. The chute that had fed the port waist gun was bent but intact. A curved section of steel maybe 3 feet long and 2 inches in diameter. Smith grabbed it with both hands, ignoring the pain, and wedged one end into the gap at the top of the door. He leaned on the chute. The aluminum groaned. The gap widened by an inch. He leaned harder, putting his full weight on the improvised lever, feeling the steel dig into his burned palms. The door moved. Not much, maybe 3 inches, but enough to create a gap at the bottom. Smith dropped the chute and grabbed the edge of the door again. He pulled, screaming through clenched teeth, his vision going white at the edges. The door came free. It swung open on its remaining hinge, revealing the radio compartment beyond. The compartment was a ruin. Equipment destroyed, cables hanging from the ceiling, the operator's chair lying on its side in a pool of congealed hydraulic fluid. The radio itself was a twisted mass of metal and shattered vacuum tubes. The compartment was empty. The radio operator had bailed with the waist gunners. Smith stepped through. The bomb bay door was on the far side of the compartment. It was intact, one of the few things in the rear of the aircraft that was still intact, and it opened smoothly when Smith turned the handle. Beyond it was the catwalk that ran the length of the bomb bay, and beyond that was the manual landing gear crank. Smith stepped onto the catwalk. The bomb bay was open to the sky. The doors had been jettisoned during the bomb run, and now there was nothing between Smith and the English Channel but 19,000 feet of cold gray air. The wind howled through the bay, buffeting him against the narrow catwalk. He grabbed the railing with his ruined hands and edged forward. The manual landing gear crank was mounted on the starboard bulkhead, just forward of the waist section. It was a simple mechanism, a hand crank connected to a mechanical linkage that would manually extend the landing gear if the hydraulic system failed. Under normal circumstances, it took 2 men to operate. One to crank, one to hold the mechanism steady. Smith was one man. He reached the crank and examined it. The handle was steel, about 18 inches long, connected to a gear mechanism that would require approximately 200 full rotations to fully extend the gear. Each rotation required perhaps 15 pounds of force. 200 rotations at 15 pounds each. 3,000 pounds of total work, applied through hands that were burned to the bone. He grabbed the handle. The steel was cold, far below freezing at this altitude, and the cold bit into his raw flesh like teeth. His fingers wouldn't close properly. The burns had destroyed the tendons or damaged them or something. He couldn't make a fist, couldn't grip the handle with any real strength. He wrapped his wrists around the handle instead. The skin on his wrists was relatively intact, burned, blistered, but not destroyed like his palms. He could press the handle against his forearms and use his arm muscles to turn the crank, bypassing his useless hands entirely. He began cranking. The first rotation was the hardest. The mechanism was stiff, the linkage cold and resistant. He felt something grind in the gear assembly, felt the handle resist his efforts, felt his forearms burn with effort. The gear moved. He cranked again, and again, and again. Each rotation brought the landing gear one step closer to locked position. He could feel the mechanism engaging, feel the weight of the gear shifting as it began to extend from the wheel wells. He counted rotations as he cranked, 10, 20, 30, watching the position indicator on the bulkhead creep from up toward down. At rotation 57, the number 2 engine quit. The sound was unmistakable. That sudden silence where there had been a constant roar, the asymmetric thrust as werewolf lurched to the left. Smith grabbed the catwalk railing to keep from falling, watched the propeller windmill to a stop through a gap in the bomb bay floor. 2 engines now. 2 engines, 19,000 feet, and 31 miles of English Channel. He went back to cranking. At rotation 92, the Focke-Wulfs returned. He heard them before he saw them, that BMW growl, distant but growing, approaching from the southeast. He stopped cranking and looked out through the open bomb bay doors. 2 fighters, just 2 this time. Perhaps they were low on fuel. Perhaps the rest of their swarm had turned back. Perhaps these two pilots simply wanted one more kill before returning to base. Smith looked at the landing gear indicator. Halfway extended, not enough. If he stopped now, the gear would be stuck in an intermediate position, neither up nor down, and the belly landing would be even more catastrophic. He looked at the tail guns. They were 150 feet behind him, past the radio compartment, past the waist section, past the fire damage and the wreckage and the unconscious body of Roy Gibson. He couldn't man the guns and crank the gear simultaneously. He had to choose. The fighters were closing, 30 seconds, maybe 40, until they reached firing range. Smith made his choice. He kept cranking, rotation 93, 94, 95. The indicator crept past the halfway point. The gear was extending, slowly, mechanically, one rotation at a time. The fighters opened fire. Cannon shells ripped through the fuselage. Smith heard them punching through aluminum, heard the shriek of torn metal, felt the aircraft shudder around him. A shell exploded somewhere forward, in the cockpit area maybe, or the nose section, and Werewolf dropped suddenly, sickeningly, before recovering. He kept cranking. Rotation 100, 105, 110. The fighters flashed past, climbing back up for another pass. Smith had perhaps 30 seconds before they came around again. He cranked faster. His forearms were cramping. The muscles were seizing up, overworked, deprived of oxygen, pushed far beyond their normal limits. He could feel the cramps building, the fibers twitching, the strength draining from his arms. Rotation 120, 130, 140. The fighters came back. This time they came from below, rising up through the open bomb bay, their cannons blazing directly into the belly of the aircraft. A shell passed between Smith's legs, so close he felt the heat of its passage, and exploded against the catwalk railing 3 feet in front of him. The railing disintegrated. The catwalk lurched, one side dropping 6 inches as its support gave way. Smith grabbed the landing gear crank to keep from falling, his weight pulling on the handle, inadvertently adding another rotation. The fighters passed, 141, 142. Smith steadied himself on the tilted catwalk and kept cranking. His forearms were on fire, not literally this time, just the fire of muscle failure, of lactic acid buildup, of tendons being pushed to their breaking point. 160, 170, 180. The indicator was approaching down. Almost there. Almost. 190. The mechanism seized. Smith pushed on the handle and felt it resist. Not the normal resistance of the gear mechanism. Something harder, something immovable. The linkage had jammed. He looked at the indicator. It showed the gear at approximately 95% extended. Almost down. Almost locked, but not quite. Not enough. He pushed harder. The handle bent. Steel shouldn't bend under human force, but this steel was cold, stressed, weakened by vibration and damage. The handle curved under Smith's weight, deforming from straight to crooked, and still the mechanism wouldn't move. He looked at the jam. The linkage ran from the crank mechanism down through the floor of the bomb bay to the wheel well below. Somewhere in that linkage, something was stuck. A bent rod, a stripped gear, a piece of debris wedged into the mechanism. He couldn't fix it from here. He looked at the wheel well. It was accessible from the bomb bay, a maintenance hatch in the floor, designed for ground crews to inspect the gear mechanism. If he could get that hatch open, he might be able to see the jam, might be able to clear it. He dropped to his knees and crawled along the tilted catwalk. The hatch was 10 feet forward, a square panel secured by 4 quick-release latches. He reached it and began working the latches with his wrists, pressing the release buttons with his forearms because his fingers wouldn't close. first latch released. Then the second. The third stuck, jammed by vibration or damage, refusing to open no matter how hard he pressed. Smith slammed his forearm against the latch. It released. The fourth latch opened smoothly, and the hatch fell away, revealing the wheel well below. Wind screamed up through the opening, freezing and violent, threatening to tear Smith from the catwalk and send him tumbling into the void. He looked into the wheel well. The problem was immediately visible. A section of hydraulic line, severed by cannon fire, just like the line in the waist section, had fallen across the main gear strut, wedging itself between the strut and the wheel well housing. The strut was jammed against the line, unable to extend the final 5% to locked position. Smith reached into the wheel well. The wind fought him. His arm was forced back by the slipstream, the pressure incredible at 180 miles per hour. He leaned further into the opening, his torso hanging over the void, his legs hooked around the catwalk railing for purchase. His fingers touched the hydraulic line. He couldn't grip it. His hands wouldn't close. The line was slippery with hydraulic fluid, cold, resistant. He pressed his palm against it and pushed, trying to dislodge it through force rather than grip. The line shifted. He pushed harder. The line moved another inch, sliding along the strut, approaching the gap between strut and housing. One more inch, and it would fall free. One more inch, and the gear would extend. He gathered what remained of his strength and pushed. The line fell away. The landing gear slammed into locked position with a metallic clang that echoed through the wheel well. The indicator on the bulkhead jumped from 95% to 100%. A green light flickered on, barely visible. Its bulb nearly burned out, confirming that the starboard main gear was down and locked. One wheel down. Smith pulled himself back onto the catwalk and looked at the port side indicator. Red light. The port gear was still jammed. He crawled across the tilted catwalk, found the port maintenance hatch, and began working the latches. At 15:21 hours, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith extended the port main landing gear. At 15:24 hours, he extended the nose gear. At 15:27 hours, B-17F Werewolf crossed the English coastline at 12,000 feet on 2 engines, with 3 green lights glowing on the landing gear indicator and a ball turret gunner lying unconscious on the bomb bay catwalk, his burned hands cradled against his chest. He had done it. Now he just had to keep Gibson alive for the landing. Smith crawled back through the bomb bay, through the radio compartment, through the ruined waist section. Every movement was agony. His hands had gone beyond pain into numbness. A dangerous numbness. The kind that meant nerve damage, the kind that meant his body was shutting down systems it couldn't afford to maintain. He reached Gibson at 15:31 hours. The tail gunner was still alive, still unconscious, still wrapped in blood-stained parachute silk, but alive. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. His pulse was weak but steady. He had survived the fire, the fighters, the 90 minutes of hell that had consumed the rear of Werewolf. Now he just had to survive the landing. Smith positioned himself next to Gibson and braced his back against the tail section bulkhead. The landing gear was down, he had made sure of that. But a gear-down landing in a shot-up B-17 was still dangerous. The tires might blow. The struts might collapse. The weakened fuselage might break apart on impact. He wrapped his arms around Gibson's torso, pinning the wounded man against his chest, and waited. The descent took 11 minutes. Smith felt it in his ears, the pressure building as Werewolf dropped from 12,000 feet to 8,000, to 5,000, to 2,000. He felt it in the vibration of the airframe, the 2 remaining engines straining to maintain airspeed. the propellers biting into thickening air. He felt it in the growing warmth as they descended into the lower atmosphere, leaving behind the killing cold of high altitude. Through the holes in the fuselage, he could see England. Green fields, gray villages. Roads winding between hedgerows. A countryside untouched by bombs, untouched by fire, impossibly peaceful after what he had just endured. He watched it slide past, growing larger, growing closer, and he thought about the life he had led before the war. The drifting, the jobs, the chip on his shoulder that had followed him from Michigan to Nevada to England. That man was gone. Whoever crawled out of this aircraft, if anyone crawled out of this aircraft, would be someone different. At 15:38 hours, the pilot's voice crackled through the internal phone system. All stations, this is the cockpit. We're on final approach for Thurley. Runway in sight. Brace for landing. Smith tightened his grip on Gibson. The landing gear touched the runway at 15:42 hours. The impact was harder than a normal landing. The hydraulic shock absorbers were empty, drained through the severed lines that had nearly killed Smith twice over. The aircraft bounced, came down again, bounced a second time. Smith felt his teeth slam together, felt Gibson's body jolt in his arms, felt the tail section flex in ways that aluminum was not designed to flex. But the gear held. The wheels rolled. The brakes engaged, what was left of them, operating on emergency reserves and prayer. Werewolf slowed from 95 miles per hour to 80, to 60, to 40. The runway sliding past the holes in the fuselage in a blur of concrete and grass. The aircraft stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. No engines. The pilot had cut them the moment the wheels touched down. No gunfire, no explosions, no fire. Just silence, and the ticking of cooling metal, and the distant sound of sirens approaching across the airfield. Smith released his grip on Gibson and slumped against the bulkhead. He was alive. They were all alive. The pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, the bombardier, the flight engineer in the forward section, Gibson, unconscious but breathing, and Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith, ball turret gunner, troublemaker, the man who had nearly washed out 3 times and had just single-handedly saved a burning B-17 over the English Channel. The rescue crews reached Werewolf within 4 minutes. They found Smith sitting in the tail section, his back against the bulkhead, Gibson's head cradled in his lap. His flight suit was charred black. His hands were unrecognizable, masses of burned tissue that barely resembled human appendages. His face was streaked with blood, smoke, and the residue of hydraulic fluid. When the medics tried to take Gibson from him, he wouldn't let go. "He's alive," Smith said. His voice was barely a whisper, his throat scorched by smoke and heat. "I kept him alive." "We know," the medic said. "We've got him now. You can let go." Smith looked at his hands. He looked at Gibson. He looked at the ruined tail section of the bomber that had become his universe for 90 minutes. He let go. The ground crews counted the holes that afternoon. They started at the nose and worked backward, marking each hole with chalk, tallying the damage on clipboards. They counted holes in the fuselage skin, holes in the wing surfaces, holes in the tail section, the bomb bay, the cockpit, the radio compartment, holes from 20mm cannon shells, holes from 7.92mm machine gun rounds, holes from flak fragments that had torn through the formation over Saint-Nazaire. The final count was 3,500 holes, 3,500 separate penetrations of the aircraft's skin, an average of 1 hole for every 2 square feet of surface area. The ground crew chief, a master sergeant with 18 years of service, said he had never seen an aircraft so damaged that was still flyable. "It shouldn't have made it back," he said. "Nothing should have kept that bird in the air. Nothing except one man." The medal came 5 weeks later. On July 15, 1943, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson presented Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at Thurley. It was the first Medal of Honor awarded to an enlisted man in the European theater of operations. The citation praised Smith's conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his own life above and beyond the call of duty. The citation did not mention the 3 times Smith had nearly washed out of training. It did not mention the chip on his shoulder, the attitude problems, the evaluations that had called him a liability. It did not mention that the Army Air Force's most problematic enlisted man had become its first enlisted hero. Smith stood at attention while Stimson pinned the medal to his chest. His hands were still bandaged. They would bear scars for the rest of his life. But he held his salute steady as the cameras flashed and the officers applauded. After the ceremony, they sent him to the mess hall. Not for a celebration, not for a hero's meal, for kitchen duty. Someone had failed to update the duty roster, and Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith, the only enlisted Medal of Honor recipient in the European theater, spent the evening of his award ceremony peeling potatoes. He didn't complain. He had spent 90 minutes fighting fire and fighters with his bare hands. Potatoes were easy. Roy Gibson survived. The tail gunner spent 4 months in hospitals in England and the United States, recovering from his wounds. The shrapnel was removed from his leg and abdomen. The bones were set. The blood loss was replaced through transfusions. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, but he walked. Decades later, when asked about May 1943, Gibson had only one thing to say about the ball turret gunner who had saved his life. They called him a troublemaker. They said he'd never amount to anything. But when it mattered, when everything was on fire and everyone else was gone, he was the only one who stayed. He stayed and he fought, and he kept me alive. That's not a troublemaker. That's a soldier. Maynard Harrison Smith flew 4 more combat missions after receiving the Medal of Honor. He was grounded in August 1943. The Army Air Forces decided that risking their only enlisted Medal of Honor recipient on additional missions was poor public relations, and spent the remainder of the war on bond tours and training duties. He returned to Michigan after the war. He worked as a tax collector. He rarely spoke about what had happened over Saint-Nazaire. He died on May 11, 1984, at the age of 73. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 7A, Grave 182. The epitaph on his headstone reads simply, Medal of Honor. There is a certain kind of courage that cannot be taught. It cannot be trained into a man through obstacle courses or firing ranges or classroom instruction. It cannot be predicted by evaluations or measured by aptitude tests. It emerges only in the crucible of combat, when everything is on fire and everyone is gone, and the only choice is between giving up and fighting on. Maynard Smith was not a model soldier. He was not an easy man to command. He was not the kind of recruit that training officers pointed to as an example for others to follow. But when his aircraft was burning at 22,000 feet, when his crewmates had bailed out and his tail gunner was bleeding to death and German fighters were circling for the kill, he did not give up. He fought the fire with his bare hands. He threw burning ammunition into the sky. He manned the guns and drove off the enemy. He crawled through smoke and flame to extend the landing gear. He kept Roy Gibson alive through sheer stubborn refusal to let the man die. And he brought Werewolf home with 3,500 holes in its skin and one ball turret gunner who had proven everyone wrong. That is not the story of a troublemaker. That is the story of a hero. If this story earned your time, hit the like button. It costs nothing and tells YouTube this video matters. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Accounts of real people facing impossible situations with nothing but skill and nerve. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Did anyone in your family serve in the Second World War? This community spans the globe, from California to Tasmania, from veterans to history students. Let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. These stories deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.